there was all kinds of information that Paul Mashatile had flown off to KwaZulu-Natal to speak to Jacob Zuma. And we had promised South Africa that we wouldn't allow an EFF, MK, ANC coalition to come into power. So at some point we decided to do the deal. The EFF was dropping its conditions for entry a lot. At the very last minute in those negotiations, the ANC fundamentally changed the negotiated agreement and wanted to push it through in a completely altered form. So under the circumstances, it was a miracle that we...
Now in this video, Helen Zille is actually breaking down some of the reasons why the DA took some of the decisions many people have actually termed getting into bed with the ANC, and explaining the reasons why all of those decisions had to go down to push South Africa into a more positive political angle. Let's listen to her break down some of the negotiations that went on between the DA and the ANC, and I'll be back for some really interesting analysis on some of the positive effects that the GNU is actually beginning to have on South Africa.
Are you happy with the deal that was struck?
I think it was the best we could get in those circumstances. Obviously, I think we could have got a better deal, but you've got to make very fine judgments about the point at which the people you're negotiating with will turn around and do a deal with someone else. And the EFF was dropping its conditions for entry a lot. And there was all kinds of information that Paul Mashatile had flown off to KwaZulu-Natal to speak to Jacob Zuma. And we had promised South Africa that we wouldn't allow an EFF, MK, ANC coalition to come into power. So at some point we decided to do the deal. We also didn't have all the information we should have had at our disposal, which was unfortunate, but it's hard to prize information out of the ANC. I've learned that. So we got the best deal we could at National. We didn't get any kind of reasonable deal in Gauteng. So we said we were not going to go in as hostages to the ANC. They would have to give us a better deal if they wanted us to take anything. And so in at National, we have an overall majority in the Western Cape, and we're in opposition in Gauteng, and we're in a coalition in KwaZulu-Natal. You know, it's not a good time to be slagging off the ANC just after we formed a government of national unity with them. But I must say it was a very, very difficult process. Our two organizations have such different cultures in terms of, for example, how we regard a signed agreement, whether you have to abide by it or whether you can just ignore it, for example. We have fundamentally different approaches to what we believe integrity is in negotiations. And at the very last minute in those negotiations, it's on record, the ANC fundamentally changed the negotiated agreement and wanted to push it through in a completely altered form. So under the circumstances, it was a miracle that we got as much as we did.
Now, Helen, does that augur well for the partnership if they know that, your motivation might be to save South Africa, but the reality is that it must feel to the ANC, and we'll get on to Gauteng in a minute, like they absolutely have you over the barrel. They can do whatever they like, you're not going to leave.
No. They can't do whatever they like. We're not going to leave. No, that's a very wrong assumption. And I think we showed it to them in Gauteng, that we have got a bottom line and we're not going to be pushed around like that. But of course, when you get into the second round, you know a lot more. And you don't simply take as a given what people say they will do. You rather look at actually what they will do, not what they say they will do. And those are two very different things in certain circumstances. So they do not know for a moment that we won't walk away. We are in the government of national unity to share power. We're not there as hostages to the ANC or as captives to the ANC, and we are going to have to work out a modus operandi. Now, what makes it very difficult is that our constitution is not really written for coalition systems. It still very much assumes a constituency-based first-past-the-post system. It's very different from the German constitution, which is drawn up because in a proportional representation system, you're always likely to end up with coalitions. And in the German constitution, they have a specific role for the chancellor, then they have a specific role for the cabinet, and then they also have relative autonomy of ministries, so that when coalition partners get to a specific ministry, they have quite an amount of relative autonomy to, for example, implement their policy there, etc. We don't have a similar provision in our constitution for coalitions in South Africa, because we wrongly believed for the longest time that it was normal for one party to get above 50% in a proportional representation system. It's quite the contrary. It is abnormal for any one party to get above 50% in a proportional representation systems. Those systems automatically tend to coalitions. Now, the ANC, I think, is using this period as a time to consolidate their base. I think they are assuming that MK, just like COPE before it, will be so riven with internal conflict, as it already is, that MK will unravel and most of those voters will come back to the ANC. I think that's what the ANC is banking on. How we see it is that the ANC's fallen above 50%, and we don't think they're likely to get above 50% again. And we have to use this to pioneer the way for coalition governments at national level. That's what we have to do. And that is how we're approaching this.
Brilliant speech by Helen Zille. Really brilliant. I think, the whole issue with the DA rescuing South Africa was one of the campaigns, and they stood true to their word, trying to fight against and do whatever it is they had to do to try to prevent what they always called a doomsday coalition. But anyway, in this video, I thought to go through some of the positives of the GNU at the moment and how the GNU could actually springboard South Africa into a much more prosperous light. Many analysts actually highlight that the hierarchical nature of South Africa's seventh administration, Government of National Unity, is pivotal. The efficacy of this GNU is heavily contingent upon the personal rapport between President Cyril Ramaphosa and DA leader John Steenhuisen. The degree of mutual trust and cooperation between these two leaders is seen as a critical factor for the administration's potential success. Conversely, a lack of harmony would likely result in failure. The question then arises, what will the nature of their relationship be? This is a complex issue shrouded in the enigmatic dynamics of political leaders' private interactions and the clandestine negotiations of power. The acquaintance is actually either limited, rendering the following observations speculative. But anyway, given the importance of this relationship, it is important to consider some of these possible strengths of the Government of National Unity. The first is the fact that this term marks President Cyril Ramaphosa's final opportunity to influence his legacy, as he is ineligible for re-election. Consequently, his focus would be on maximizing achievements within the next 5 years, providing a strong incentive for cooperative efforts. Secondly, President Ramaphosa excels in fostering common ground, engaging with individuals at different opinions, and facilitating thorough discussions. However, it remains uncertain how adept John Steenhuisen is in these areas. Steenhuisen has built his reputation as a dynamic, combative parliamentary figure known for his sharp retorts and incisive criticisms. For the success of the GNU, he will need to adopt a more refined and considerate approach swiftly. Thirdly, and notably, the constituencies of President Ramaphosa and the DA leader John Steenhuisen do not overlap. This distinction ensures that governmental decisions will not be driven by competition for the same voter base, thereby reducing the potential for one-manship, right? As a result, although decision-making may be challenging, it will likely reflect the interests of a broad and diverse segment of South Africa's society. Fourthly, there is another positive aspect to consider. Unlike South Africa's previous government of national unity in 1994, which dissolved swiftly, this iteration represents a different dynamic. While the relationship between F.W. de Klerk and then President Nelson Mandela was not particularly strained, for de Klerk, the GNU represented a demotion from president to joint deputy president. But in the opposite converse, for John Steenhuisen, this GNU signifies a significant advancement in his political career, both as a party representative and as a Minister of Agriculture. In many respects, this period represents a crucial and defining opportunity for Steenhuisen. And lastly, the GNU can be likened to a forced marriage, with circumstances necessitating its formation still prevailing. The DA still holds a significant advantage in its ability to withdraw from the GNU, which would be a strategic move it can only utilize once. But conversely, the ANC would face severe repercussions if the DA were to leave. Now, if both parties can maintain a broader perspective, prioritizing national interests above their own, the GNU has the potential to endure to its full term. So these are kind of like some of the few possibilities that I've actually been able to collate from reports to really understand the strengths that the GNU has in the moment and how they could play a really positive role in improving the lives of South Africa. We know that that's the major complaint of many South Africans for the ANC, that the ANC over the last 30 years hasn't been able to do much to improve the life of South Africans, despite the fact that it has enjoyed a huge support of the electorate in South Africa. And so hopefully the GNU, with these positive strengths between the relationship between DA leader John Steenhuisen and ANC's President Cyril Ramaphosa, could actually forge a sort of like a different bond at the national level, although we see a lot of struggles at the provincial level, but we can still keep being positive that at the national level, we might see a much more positive light for the government of national unity. But what do you guys think about this video, Helen Zille's speech here? Share your thoughts in the comments.